Hello, everybody. Looks like we're doing this for the first time. Apologies. Actually, it was deliberate because you all had delicious lunch, so we want you to have some exercise and change rooms. But I guess we lost 10 minutes. Shouldn't make a big difference in the bigger picture. So I'm not going to dwell here and immediately hand over to the chair of the session. So it's obviously a spotlight session that kind of is backward-looking, what has been achieved in regional studies research, but more importantly, where are we going from here? What are our future priorities and so on? So we're going to have 6 short presentations, and then we would really like to open it up to a kind of discussion with the audience, engaging on probably some specific questions we will post on the final slide once the presentations are done. So just that everybody knows the plan, I will now hand over to our chair, Heike Meyer, who is also the president of the Regional Studies Association. Heike, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for being so agile. So I congratulate you, because if you look into present priorities, future directions, we need to be agile and move around. So thank you very much. I think this is such a fitting panel for the 60th anniversary of the Regional Studies Association, because we have an esteemed panel. Each of them is very distinguished. I won't present all the accolades that they bring with them. I will just say their names and their current affiliations and not take away too much time from you. So first, we have Grete Gansauer. She is an assistant professor of sustainable communities in the Haupt School of Environment and Natural Resources at the University of Wyoming. And she also co-organized the EDGE Research Network. She's also on the board of the Regional Studies Association. So, Grete, I turn to you.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here today. I'm so excited to see this much interest in this session. I've prepared some remarks, and I'm honored to share my perspective on broad directions on left behind places, regional inequalities, and place-based policy in the regional studies field, and where I think we're headed on this front. Regional inequalities in the global north have been intensifying since roughly the turn of the millennium. Transitions to a digitalized and financialized service economy point toward geographic consolidation of industry in highly productive urban agglomerations. But the growth has not been equally shared. An intensified public and private sector investment in the most lucrative service sector industries and regions drove greater divergence between cores and peripheries. Globalized trade and finance enabled commodities and secondary production to seek comparative advantages in the global south and semi-periphery, bringing on deindustrialization of former industrial regions and resource-producing regions in the global north. Fiscal austerity and a hollowing out of local property tax bases constrained local institutions' capacity to sustain standards of public service and infrastructure access available in prosperous places. In 2016, demonstrations of public support for authoritarian populist political agendas such as the Brexit referendum, the French Yellow Vest movement, and Donald Trump's first election in my own country ignited attention of the academic and policy community towards so-called places that don't matter. Suddenly, the spatial dimensions of social and economic inequalities were sharply in focus, presenting opportunities for the regional studies field. And there is a new political imperative as electoral maps demonstrating the geography of discontent correlated too well with the spatiality of regional socioeconomic distress as mapped here. Hence, much research over the past decade now, since 2016, which is crazy, focuses on quantifying and mapping various social, economic, and of course, electoral indicators of left behindness and discontent. At this point, regional studies has done a pretty good job identifying where distress coalesces, at least in the UK, US, and Europe. But more work is needed outside of these regions and across the globe. And as I'll argue next, more work is needed beyond just the where. As a field, it's time to turn our attention toward what regional inequality looks and feels like in left behind places and communities, and why and how they become peripheralized. The story I've told you likely sounds familiar. It narrates the recent history of regional inequality and relative inequalities. Even terms like left behind or lagging regions imply relativity to other superstar or high growth regions. But deep socioeconomic distress and its associated political discontents are processes which involve interplays between local and structural factors and relationships between social and cultural and political economic processes. The widely accepted narrative that I've described above fails to account for such dynamics in full detail, and doing so will require operationalizing not only a relative perspective on regional inequality, but also a relational perspective which problematizes place-based histories alongside structural drivers of regional divergence. Perhaps you're listening to this provocation and calling to mind uneven development scholarship of the 1980s and 90s and beyond, including authors like Doreen Massey, who emphasized interplays between place-based histories and structural dynamics as drivers of uneven development. Left behind places are nothing new. They have existed under several iterations of capitalism, and there's an entire body of work on geographical uneven development which describes how such unevenness comes about. Other theories in vogue in the early 2000s, including endogenous place-based development and peripheralization theory, which emphasizes the political and economic processes which produce marginalized space, will also be helpful to analyzing contemporary regional inequality and designing place-based solutions. In all, a major gap in the left behind places debate at the moment is that in its focus on mapping and locating places, left behind places, it risks obscuring the particularities of place. It has left the drivers, processes, and place-based dynamics of contemporary uneven development under-theorized. So my first call is for our field to revive theoretical perspectives on uneven development, which emphasize the processes by which left behind places come about. Alongside mapping and locating relative spatial inequalities, as you can see on the left, there's a need to prioritize the relational processes which drive regional divergence and decline, which lead to banners like you see on the right. We can thank our field and many people in this room for elevating regional inequalities as a political agenda item. The result has been place-based policies, which were once outright rejected as growth strategies, re-emerging on political agendas, in part because of their potential to address social inclusion, as has been, at least until now, the case with EU cohesion policy. Or, in part, they've revived due to a realization that left behind places and their cheap property and labor markets are vestiges of latent economic potential, as has largely been the motivation of place-based industrial policy strategies evident in the US and China. Yet differences in place-based policy design, especially whether they prioritize growth or social equity, matter to how regional inequalities are addressed and to which types of regions they stand to benefit. For example, you can imagine how a regional policy delivered through industrial policy meant to deliver growth at a national scale would direct investments toward high potential regions, places which already have a baseline of assets, institutions, networks, which are critical to successful development of national key sectors. On the other hand, a place-based policy with social inclusion at its heart might use a more needs-based approach and focus on building out basic public goods and infrastructures in the most deprived regions. Place-based policies are not, therefore, wholesale corrections on their own for regional inequality. Their designs and strategic intent matter to which types of regions benefit and the regional development tactics they prescribe. So my second invitation to the field is to build and advocate effective place-based policy. We're going to need to make sure that policies truly attend to the needs of place. So to illustrate this point, and in closing, I'd like to offer a brief vignette of a rural region where I work in the state of Wyoming. Eastern Wyoming, pictured here just in April on a fittingly dreary day. In Eastern Wyoming, I'm developing a case study And this region is disconnected economically and socially. It's demographically and economically stagnant. The main industry in the region is sugar beet farming and cattle ranching. In the 1990s, they recruited the Wyoming State Women's Penitentiary as an economic development tactic, and making the public sector the second largest employer to agriculture in the region. The largest town has 6,000 people. The smallest towns are clinging to their schools, sometimes with enrollments under 20 students in total. And it takes about 3 hours in good road conditions to get to a city which has retail services beyond a basic grocery store. These counties, the 3 counties where I work, voted for Donald Trump in each election at a rate of around 90%. So this is Trump's rural America, and on a map, this is a left-behind geography of discontent. Eastern Wyoming is not going to be the next globally competitive tech hub. So does this place matter? Yes, if for no other reason than citizen taxpayers live here. So rather than place-based industrial policy, which was the Biden administration's antidote to regional inequality, this place needs to deliver reliable infrastructure, healthcare, and basic services for people to earn a dignified livelihood, quality of life baselines which are difficult to sustain in a remote context with a thin local tax base and few local employers. So my closing invitation to the field is this: as we advocate for regional policies to remain on political agendas, there's a need to focus on the processes by which specific places become left behind, and to design interventions which put the place back in place-based policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Grete. Our next presenter is Maria Savona. She is a professor of economics of innovation at the Science Policy Research Unit, SPRU, at the University of Sussex, and she is also a professor of applied economics at the Department of Economics and Finance at Lewis University in Rome. So Maria, you're up.
Thank you very much, and thanks also Dieter and Ron for inviting me to this low-pressure session on the future of regional studies. So I will try to, is that my slides? Okay. So I think my presentation, my points will fall nicely after your presentation. So I'll try to think about what an epistemic community such as this one can remain vital, and it does when it tries to address continuous challenges. And this is my view on an overgreen challenges, which is employment imbalances in the European Union, but put in a context which is now particularly challenged. So I think we should be thinking about what is at stake now that was a little bit less before. We all know that the geopolitical landscape is dramatically changing, and before it was mentioned as the European discontent on peripheral regions. So what's happening is that in the current geopolitical landscape, what I feel is that the European model is really falling behind, and I think we should resist this. Why so? Because, as was mentioned, the European discontent is, as Andrés Rodriguez Poses put it very nicely, not only related to cultural issues, but to a fundamental stagnancy of growth. And this is something that we should address. So the future of regional studies should actually tackle these places, the places that don't matter, but we should also try to understand why they don't matter, so why they fall on the cracks on the regional policies. What I also found particularly concerning is that in the current landscape, the European discontent is being channeled into a different narrative that wasn't really European before, something related to strategic autonomy, economic security, defense security, and so on. And clearly we are facing, according to me, a sort of trade-off for what we're going to prioritize in terms of regional policies in the next future. What is happening now, but then again it's my view open to discussion, is that this is risking to overhaul whatever the European model has been so far for a long time. And part of this story is related to the peripheral regions, so the discontented places. So the reason why I put employment at the center of European priorities is exactly to tackle these issues. So the discontented places are those that are too rich to be, as Andrés Rodriguez Poses put it nicely, again, I think it's particularly indicative, they're too rich to fall into the cohesion policies, but also too stagnant and unglamorous, as he puts it, to be driving changes and structural changes and upgrading and so on. So there are those places who are really suffering, and these are those places that are really driving this, this new political view of Europe not being trustworthy anymore in delivering what it has been promising for a long time. So I think there's also a huge trade-off in terms of this. The huge trade-off is that achieving twin transition in a regionally aware, regionally balanced way, it's something that is being possibly buried in behind this issue on security and protection. So strategic autonomy at the level of Europe is actually driving away the need to tackle twin transition in a just way. This is literally, objectively, also budget trade-off. If we move to, to security and so on, there will be less funds to achieve twin transition and even less funds to address the European discontent, if we put it. Now, this work is, I'm just going to present a little bit of a European map this time, which complements, I think, the previous presentation. This is part of a work we did with Ariel Wirkerman and Tommaso Carli on regional studies, by the way, published. And what we found, to try to understand what is really underpinning this European regional discontent based on employment stagnancy, is not only the lack of innovation potential, which we all know and Europe has been trying to address in terms of smart specialization strategies, but also trade centrality. What we found is that European can be mapped in terms of trade central blocks, and not only this, but we identified a sort of core periphery structure which resonates with this discontented region. This core periphery structure is really something that is structural and is fractal. So within core central trade blocks, there are peripheral regions that can be even more developed or employment stagnant than central regions in peripheral blocks. So we should take into account this, and in my view, and maybe we find technicalities on the paper, but in my view, what is possibly useful, what would be possibly useful in terms of regional policy to tackle this stagnancy is to not only to talk about a smart specialization strategy and to make these regions more innovative, but also putting back in terms of trade. So ideally, what we also found is that if these regions are central in high-tech input trade, they're also very much more likely to be conducive of employment growth if they are innovative. Vice versa, if they're not very innovative, so if they are innovative, not being trade central might really void the innovation performance, so the employment elasticity of a high innovation performance. So I think that the development trap of places that do not matter might be due to the fact that we need to complement innovation policies with bringing back trade into this context. We should pay attention to trade centrality, particularly in a context where now the narrative is around autonomy. And we should make the European single market a priority again and develop trade flows, high-tech input trade flows within this context. This might also need to revive the idea of unrelated diversification, to use a jargon that is very dear to this community, and I buy this, but also basically to use this new narrative in a way that is positive for European development, and particularly for those places that are at the periphery of trade flows. And obviously, this is something that needs to be addressed by making sure that these policies are really employment friendly. So this is something that, to me, as an economist of innovation with some interest in regional policy, is particularly relevant in this particular moment. So I think to wrap it up, the issue, my view is that we should put Europe back at the center of the European model, at the center of policy priority, particularly in this context, in this geopolitical context, and also highlight how trade flows and high-tech input trade flows are central to drive upgrading and employment upgrading. So to make sure that those peripheral regions that are the places that don't matter, that are really not enough poor to deal with cohesion policy, but really stagnant, they are back on track, and this might also hopefully drive a little bit more trust in a European model. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maria. This is a spotlight session. Please write down your questions. We will have plenty of time for a roundtable discussion after all 6 presented. I welcome André Torre to the podium. He's Distinguished Professor of Economics at the University Paris-Saclay, and he focuses on spatial and industrial economics, and he will bring us sort of a view of environmental, circular innovations and economics. So a little bit of a different look than the previous 2 speakers. I turn to you.
Well, welcome. Just one thing, as it has been said, I will try to speak about environmental economics and the relation to spatial economics or regional economics. So if you wonder if there is any relation, I have good news for you. Yes, there is. It is, and I will try to show that it is the case regarding circular economy. Why did I choose the circular economy? Because the circular economy, in a way, is a quite modest way to cope with the future, and in order to integrate environmental topics with economic topics as well. Because if you looked at the past, when you have those works, those researches about sustainable development, they were so broad and they were so majestic that it was impossible to cope with them in the end. That's the reason why I went to circular economy, and you know probably the definition of circular economy, which are quite simple, and it's about the so-called 3R paradigm or trilogy, which is about reduce, reuse, and recycle, which means that you have to reduce the level of goods and natural resources you use. You have to try to prolong the life cycle of the products by different means, and then to try to recycle them, either to re-put into the production or by waste, or even to transform them into energy. Okay, all those kind of things, they think at first glance not to have a lot to look with spatial and regional economics. But there are 2 main dimensions which are very, very important and which are very crucial. It is the systemic and the spatial dimension. First one is the systemic dimension. It makes no sense to perform in circular economy alone. You need to have partners in order to exchange, recycle goods, or to share good practices and so on. And there are networks of firms and labs involved in recycling and reusing waste, and also with collective efforts to adopt circular economy practices. And also, it's important to say, it is also at a local level the involvement of local stakeholders, because you cannot perform a kind of circular economy, for example, biogas, without the agreement of local population. Otherwise, they will oppose and they will raise conflict against your project. The second thing is about the spatial content. So it makes no sense to have a circular economy, a virtuous circular economy, if it is not localized, if it is not territorialized. So if you go with boats, on trains, or planes, and you transport either natural resources all around the globe or dishes all around the globe, like it is done now, for example, in Africa, in countries like Ghana or else, with the clothes, for example, it is not. It is circular, because it turns around the globe, but it is not virtuous. And it is not possible to do circular economy when you export your externalities. So this means that in the end, we have these two things: place matters, and we have a territorialization of circularity with circular flows, which requires local management and also territorial conditions like infrastructure, institutions, culture to develop at the local level. So what I claim with many other people is that in order to have a virtuous circular economy, you need to be territorialized. And if you look at the past, how could we cope with that? There are two streamlines in order to help us to think about this question. First one is the one of the local systems of production. So there have been a lot of works related to clusters, district, milieu, and so on and so on. All those works, they are performed so well, but mainly they are devoted to linear economics. And on the other hand, there is another stream which is a bit more modest, and it's the one of industrial symbiosis, it's the one of eco-industrial parks, like in the example of the symbiosis of Skalundborg in Denmark, for example. So they are dealing with the question of circular economy and environment, but they are considering the spatial case in a very, I would say, naive or restricted way. This is the reason why I'm claiming that it's possible to think about the concept of territorial circular ecosystems, which is an analytical framework which involves actors, resource, institution at the local level, and which account for regional diversity and integrates different types of proximities and also a multiscalar and a systemic approach. So if we deal with this territorial circular ecosystem, we see that we have to encompass and to take into account a large range of actors. Of course, firms and labs, but also local authorities, but also civil society, and also local governance bodies. And all together, they have to work for the sake of this territorial circular ecosystem. If we look at the resources, there are different types of resources. Of course, there are the natural resources. Of course, there are also the exchange of material flows between those units, but also that's a question of finance, that's a question of knowledge, that's a question of human resource, that's a question of infrastructure and logistics. And then, if we come to institutions, of course, there are hard institutions, like, say, municipalities, local decentralized public bodies, and so on, but also, of course, there are the cultural norms and the incentive systems at the local level. This means that this territorial ecosystem is based on interaction and synergies between those dimensions within a local and spatialized content. So in the end, what do we have? We have this system, we know it in a way, like spatial economics, because we're thinking about localized systems of production. But it's not linear production, because it's circular, and it's not only production, because it is the involvement also of local population, and it is the health which is brought by local institutions as well. Of course, a TCA can be incomplete. Most of them do not encompass all those relations, but it is an objective for the future, because the question was the one of the future. It's difficult for an economist to think about the future. I'm used to think about the past, but very, very difficult for guys like me to think about the future. But maybe with the TCA, we can prolong, we can have plans for the future, and in order to reduce, reuse, recycling the materials, and that's the way to indicate to policymakers maybe the objectives and the way to reach them. Okay.
Thank you very much, André. This actually provides a very nice passage to Ron Boschma's presentation on institutional change. Ron Boschma is professor of regional economics at Utrecht University and also professor at the business school at Stavanger University. Last year, Ron received the Nobel Prize in geography. We don't have a Nobel Prize, but the Vautrin-Lüth Prize, which is considered as the Nobel Prize. So I hand over to you. Thank you, Ron.
Yeah, thank you. No surprise, I want to talk about evolution economic geography, and something I've been struggling with my whole academic life, basically, is how to incorporate institutions in evolution economic geography. I've been struggling a lot with that myself, because already some decades ago we wrote that, of course, institutions matter, they're very important, they're an interesting object of study, and I think economic geographers have always been very keen in putting that in on their research agenda, and rightly so. Thinking then about, can we think about institutions from an evolutionary perspective, how would that change our perspective on institutions, right? Because that is a relevant question. Or do we still want to address institutions and analyze it from the same perspective that, that maybe even non-evolutionary approaches also follow? So when writing it down a few decades ago, it was really about to what extent to avoid that institutions would determine spatial outcomes, but they have more contingent impact, because what we also observed is that when we looked at a country or a region which were subject to the same set of institutions, we find still a lot of variety inside those territories, and then you could really think about what is the role of institutions then. Of course, there's a lot of literature on regional innovation systems, and it's already out there for a long time. And their institutions, of course, matter because they actually have an impact on the intensity, but also the nature of linkages that are formed across different organizations that are part of an institutional innovation system. But also, an evolutionary approach should take a dynamic approach, because it is it's evolution, it's dynamic by definition. So we should also look at institutional change, and I'm not so sure whether we actually have addressed that in a very serious manner. It was also about the role of agencies and institutional entrepreneur, or place-based leadership, as we call it nowadays, which is really about creating new institutions or adapting institutions in order to enable the development of new economic activities, or to that existing activities can adapt. And last but not least, of course, there was also the notion of institutional lock-in, which is a very evolutionary concept, I would say, in which history matters. So there were some building blocks there, but I was not entirely sure whether that was sufficient. If we look at empirical studies in evolution economic geography more broadly defined, I would say is that the more qualitative case study approach is much more dominant in that respect in looking at institutions and especially institutional change. I mean, I've written that myself when I'm doing quantitative analysis by saying, okay, but institutional change we cannot really address, so really qualitative case studies they can really dig into that topic and provide very rich insights. But to be honest, there is very little work on institutions for a more quantitative perspective in evolution economic geography. And if so, institutions are often treated in a static way, and that is not what you want, right, from an evolutionary perspective. So what about institutional change, and really, have we really developed an understanding and analyzed it from a quantitative perspective to shed light on what type of institutional change happens and in what type of regional settings? What we also tend to do is then we just plug in a number of institutions because variables are available. And then we analyze those institutions we analyze them in isolation. But what about complementarities between institutions, right? Because an institution might only become effective when they match with other institutions in a particular region. And have we really developed understanding in that respect, and did we do that? Did we take on that challenge when doing quantitative analysis in evolution economic geography? I don't think we did, and we should. Also policy, the same story. When we would look at policy and we would like to see, okay, to what extent policy will have an effect on regional outcomes and whether they have intended outcomes. We look at policy in isolation. Well, there is a huge literature on policy mix, and we really do not take that on board, at least not in a quantitative way. So there are a lot of things that we could take on and really incorporate an institutional approach in evolution economic geography, and really have to do a much better job in that respect when taking also a quantitative perspective. And I think it can be done because nowadays, I mean, in the past you could say, hey, you know, there are no data, right? And especially at the subnational scale, you didn't have that much data to analyze to start with. And therefore, it would be better left to qualitative case study approaches. But nowadays, you have fantastic institutional data sets, not only at the national scale, but also at the subnational scale. So let's exploit them, and maybe now institutional change can also be studied from a quantitative perspective in evolution economic geography. And there we have a challenge to meet, because there we have to talk about how to explain institutional change, because if that is important in order to induce structural change in our economies, how can we explain that? I think we still have, again, from a quantitative perspective, very little understanding of what type of opportunities do regions have to implement institutional change, and to what extent that will be affected by the existing set of institutions that are already in place. Which regions are more likely to build new institutions? And do we know which regions might be more equipped to make the required institutional changes? I'm not so sure whether we actually know a lot about that. And to me, I think it still remains a kind of black box. Then, about institutional complementarities. Also thinking about which activities in our economies might have similar institutional requirement, because that would open a new thinking in which some of us already have that addressed from an empirical point of view. I mentioned yesterday also by Louise and Mario here, in which you can actually use this idea in order to explain regional diversifications. Why are regions more capable of diversifying into new economic activities? Because they might already have institutions that enable them to move into new economic activities, because the activities that they're already specialized in are linked to a certain set of institutions that can also enable them to move into new activities that will use the same set of institutions. Let's thank you for your attention. And now I will present Dieter's presentation. let's go. Thank you for your attention. I cannot go back.
I'll do it. Wait, the PowerPoint karaoke is only at 4 o'clock this afternoon. Highly recommend that. So next up is Dieter Kogler. It's actually a nice segue into methods because he will present on sort of new advances in the age of AI. Dieter is associate professor in economic geography in the School of Architecture, Planning and Environmental Policy at University College Dublin, and he's also the founder and director of the UCD Spatial Dynamics Lab.
Thank you, Heike. Thanks for the kind of transition you provided, Ron, there. So I'm delighted, obviously, to be here. Ron and I were asked originally to organize this, and I'm very pleased with the panel we were able to put together here. In terms of the topics, of course, there was some considerations, and needless to say, just like Ron, I work very much in the evolutionary economic geography realm, so I will mainly focus on that. But unlike Ron, I probably want to talk much more towards the methods and the opportunities that might lie ahead for us. Evolutionary economic geography as a paradigm is really just 2 decades old. Now, it doesn't mean it doesn't build on very old concepts like generalized Darwinism, creative destruction, Schumpeter, all the way down to regional innovation systems, learning regions, and so on. Now, one particular focus point, of course, is innovation, technological change, and this links them back to knowledge. And as you can appreciate, knowledge is not your average good. It behaves very different, right? It's also very path dependent. Knowledge builds up over time. It's very cumulative. There's relationships. There's networks within knowledge. And of course, then this notion that what you know today kind of determines where you can go tomorrow. And of course, we tested this in a framework where you can classify knowledge into domains, into categories. Most prominently, of course, is patent data in this regard. It's legal documents of innovative outputs. They're consistent over a long time. They have a very detailed classification system. And as you see there on the top left, you can conceptualize the economy then in top-level sectors, subsectors, and you also see the intersection between those. And once you, of course, translate this into a network, you can scale that network. It can be the overall knowledge production. It can be the knowledge production of a country, of a region, even a city. And then, of course, this begs the question, does your current knowledge structure determine where will you go in the future? And we tested this already over 10 years ago. It's actually work Ron and I did together with our friend P.A. Pallant. And it worked out beautifully, as you see at the bottom left there. The probability that you actually add on a new capability in your region that's highly related to what you do already is pretty much perfect. Now, this makes you think, right? Because there's kind of it's deterministic, kind of. So you can't escape it's evolutionary lock-in, if that makes sense. So you do go forward, but you might not be able to jump very much. And it's very much determined then, of course, of the search space where you operate. And over time, of course, we realized there was an overemphasis on probably endogenous change. There's obviously influx from outside a region through collaboration, through mobility, all of those kind of things. So a piece we published 10 years later shows the probability, of course, changes in the context of how much you collaborate. But then, of course, it depends also with whom you collaborate, right? Because technologies and knowledge itself, it has kind of life cycles. But it's not like a life cycle of a product where it gets adopted, it reaches maturity, and then gets replaced, let's say, in terms of creative destruction. There's knowledge domains that become very prominent as an input in the recombinant knowledge space, then they go away for a while, they come back. And of course, you see this in the networks through network measures like degree centrality, eigenvectors, and so on. But then there's also the realization that, of course, firms are very important in this regard. Firms, especially multinationals or multi-locational firms. Why do European firms want to have a presence in Silicon Valley? It's very expensive in terms of housing, labor costs, and so on. Well, it is the knowledge, right? It's sticky, it's there. And if you're not there, you can't really benefit in the same extent as from far away. So considering all of those things, we wrote a piece a few years back where we talked about those networks within the networks. So also in terms of the multidimensionality, it involves, of course, individuals, scientists, inventors. They work at firms, institutions. Those are placed in regions. Always remember, regions are not really rational actors in this context. They are more like containers. Of course, coherent containers, but nevertheless. So just a couple of more slides to now drill down how does this relate to the current development of novel technologies like AI, like large language models, and so on. And I would like to focus on this whole idea of research and innovation. And of course, I know it's a very linear view of innovation, and there's a lot of feedback loops and this and that, but just the appreciation that most of the research we have done so far relies on technological knowledge, on patents. We all would agree, I suppose, at a venue like here, the science behind all of this is very crucial. And studies have shown that the reliance of science in modern technologies increases quite significantly, also with complexity. So here goes. How do you compare or bring together science with technology? They have different classification systems. They have different purposes, right? One is more on the basic side. It's not commercialization, might not be the first thought when you do scientific research. When you do patenting, probably it is. They're unbalanced. There's, of course, many, many more publications than patents. There's no discrete link. Now, patents do cite scientific literature, but that link has not been explored very, very extensively. And on top, it's not a legal requirement. So a firm doesn't need to add any scientific references and so on. So this is where basically AI comes in. So you have millions of documents on either side. You have different classification systems. But of course, if you do have the full text, you can do some sort of semantic mapping. You can find similarities. We start doing this with the Web of Science, so this is published work just a few months back on millions of scientific documents, alone determining interdisciplinarity. The problem is, for example, in the Web of Science, it's classified by journal. Just take regional studies. Would you classify it as an economics journal, as social science, as a geography journal? Well, we don't know. The Web of Science determines a label, and it might not be very reflective. Thank you. On the same token, what do you do with technologies that are not strictly defined, that don't have a single code? And here, AI itself is a very good example. AI obviously penetrates very different spheres in terms of networks, in terms of all sorts of applications. Then also the distinction between what is foundational AI versus applied AI. All of those kind of things are very difficult to be determined via just technical codes and so on. So what we then try to do is we put them all together in a semantic space. And again, I can only stress it's millions of patterns. So when I work with the Web of Science, it has about 250 million publications. If I work with the citations, I'm at 2 billion links and so on. It's not possible to do that kind of research anymore just based on traditional methods. And when you put it all in there together, you of course see once in a sudden how science relates to technology, but also how policy, because nothing hinders you from also infusing policy documents, funding call documents. So just think about how future research is steered through policy. Of course, through public funding. So if you go through the Horizon call documents, it kind of gives you a very good idea where research priorities lie for policy going forward. So AI, obviously a threat in terms of labor. It might be an opportunity for productivity, but it's especially an opportunity, I think, for novel research methods going forward in regional studies. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Dieter. Next up is Elvira Uyarra. She is Professor of Innovation Studies at the University of Manchester and also Executive Director of the Manchester Institute of Innovation Research. I love your title, Regional Studies for Regional Policy. So I hand over to you.
Thank you. I didn't pick the title. That's Dieter's. Thank you, Dieter. I'm not sure I will honor the title of the presentation, but I'll do my best. Well, it's a real honor to be part of these discussions for the 60th anniversary of Regional Studies. Happy birthday, Regional Studies. Actually, I remember my first encounter with Regional Studies was in 2000, in the year 2000, when this conference was organized in Bilbao, where I was a student at the time. And that was, wow, 25 years ago. And yeah, so this feels very, very special. So yeah, we're here to discuss the future of regional studies and its policy relevance. And as we do that, I would like to acknowledge the work of my colleague, Professor Stan Metcalf, who recently passed away. And he was a leading figure in innovation studies and evolutionary economics, and his work on innovation dynamics and innovation policy continues to shape our thinking today, and also was very influential in, well, obviously evolutionary economics, but also evolutionary economic geography. So we're discussing about, you know, I think Ron mentioned the work of Dick Nelson yesterday in his presentation. So how to remember the leading figures in the field. And there also, I mean, I want to honor his memory, but also I realize a lot of the things I was going to say anyway are very much influenced by his work. Which are around the idea, well, the role of agency, the role of problems as drivers of innovation systems, the role of demand on markets, the role of policy and adaptive policy making. And even though he was not a regional scholar, a lot of his work has tremendous geographical implications. Of course, he was very much influenced by the work of Schumpeter and Marshall. So Stan coined the term restless capitalism. So basically he said that capitalist economies are driven by experimentation and novelty creation, and he saw the entrepreneurs and the entrepreneurial process as a key driver of this. and a process that transforms economies from within in a kind of irreversible and path-dependent way. So, of course, there's tremendous work going on in regional studies and published in the journal Regional Studies around the role of agency and entrepreneurs widely understood as agents of change in regional development. And of course, entrepreneurship is a local event and is very much shaped by place-based dimensions. The other thing I want to mention, so of course firms and entrepreneurs are critical to innovation, but they are embedded in a wider network of knowledge generation and disseminating institutions, so systems of innovation. And Stan talked a lot about systems of innovation, but he saw them as temporary and problem-oriented configurations. He said that they aren't permanent structures, they form around specific problems and evolve as challenges change. They said that they might not occur naturally at any predetermined level, national, regional, local, sectoral, and they don't have fixed boundaries. So I think this is really interesting because this suggests that we should pay more attention about how problems are framed and how solutions are developed through collaborative processes and how the constellations of actors might shift over time as problems evolve. This leads to questions about who defines problems and how and where. It also raises questions about the geography of problems. There's a geography of problems which is different from the geography of solutions, so the geography of innovation that we talked about. And it's also interesting from a policy perspective or from kind of path creation perspective because temporary innovation systems are likely to emerge dedicated to solving specific local problems. And that might in turn drive the growth of knowledge and structural change. And that links to the very nice presentation of Michaela Truppel yesterday where she kind of talked about problem-oriented innovation systems. So for me, innovation systems are problem-oriented, but the nature of the problems have changed. And we are now grappling with societal challenges and problems. So we need more stories about this, more deep, good quality case studies on how this happens in real places over time. My next point is about the role of markets, the crucial role of demand and markets in innovation processes. So Stan Meffgott said that innovation studies tend to miss half of the story. Innovation is an economic act that doesn't depend just on technology, but also the perception of market opportunities. So he reminded us that innovation is not invention. So regional strengths are not just technological strengths or scientific strengths. Regions have problems, values, and assets that can be drivers for path creation. And also he reminded us that markets are not natural phenomena but created institutions. This means that we can actively create markets and shape markets. We did some work about the region, the government of Galicia, how they coordinated place-based strategies shaping demand through procurement, regulation, and standards, and how that opened opportunities for path creation. And in a recent paper, we talk about how we can move from matters of concerns, problems, to matters of worth, markets. Next point is about policy. He talked about adaptive policy making and how evolutionary policy making is a complex issue, and how policies need to take a broad approach, reaching objectives and tools. So we should be using a broad portfolio of policies and mixes. But also we need to be carefully looking at implementation and adaptive implementation. So policies are not context-free tools from a toolbox. Their effectiveness depends on how they're implemented, interpreted, and interacting with existing systems and actors. They're a bit like the policy mix dimension you were talking about. And implementation is, of course, local. You know, it depends on actors on the ground. So my final point is that where is really an invitation to put place in new generation innovation policies. This is called transformative or mission-oriented policies. And there's people in the room that are already working on this. We wrote a recent editorial as part of a special issue where we kind of took aim at this idea of missions and how they tend to be shaped as especially blind endeavors disconnected from the geographies of innovation. And this devalues the role of citizen regions as places for policy and experimentation and implementation, but also limits the societal and demographic legitimacy of these policies and these goals. And we know that failing to do that leads to this geography of discontent and populism. So there are several themes in the special issue, including this idea of problem framing, how that is done by whom, and where are the tensions, the idea of policy implementation and taking an inclusive and broad approach to policy making, and also the scaling element, the scaling strategies and the politics of the kind of the integrated kind of policy making processes. And I've been looked at in a kind of stir way, so I'm going to leave it at that. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for these great presentations. Dieter put together a couple of questions for us to focus on, but if you don't mind, I will open up the floor. Maybe these questions will help us sort of bridge, but I would guess we have so many people in the audience that you have questions or you would like to add to these questions that Dieter added. So I would like to open up the floor, and there's probably somebody with a microphone, so who would have a question right there? Yeah, and then, okay.
Hi, my question is probably to Ron, who talked about evolving institutions. One of the themes in this conference has been universities and regional development. And in the context of evolutionary histories, we're probably at quite a crossroads of higher education, given the attack that is being made in the US on institutions, learning institutions. How do you think your framework will help institutions adapt to those challenges, and particularly to the left-behind places where they might be located?
Let me collect a few questions. We have a question over there. If the microphone could go over there. Is there one more question? Please raise your hand now, because then we can look for the microphone. One more question? Okay, I hand to you.
Thank you very much. I think all of us enjoyed the presentation, so I have a question for anyone who wants to make a comment. We know from various disciplines that what we call the social field, the quality of relationships among the various actors at the regional level for implementing successfully any policy is crucial. How do you think the field of regional studies should help improve the social field?
Mm-hmm. Perhaps we turn for the first question. This was aimed at Ron, right? Higher education as an institution, right? So perhaps, Ron, you could answer the first, and then we will take a turn on the second question. Yeah, you can push the button, I think.
Yeah. Thanks. That's a very challenging question. Let's put it like that. Of course, universities are under extreme pressure nowadays, right? So because there's kind of anti-science movement happening, right? So you might say, well, that's a new institution, right? They try to change the rules of the game that we almost all of us, well, certainly in those rooms, all of us took for granted, right? So that were not contested. This is actually institutional change in practice, right? So this is a new movement trying to institutional change. Of course, there's a lot of contestation. And let's see what will be the outcome. It will be a huge battle that we have to fight, and we are part of that. This is exactly what I was talking about, right? This is about institutional change and what type of constraints there are in order to make that happen, because the anti-science movement is getting stronger and stronger, and we have something. And to what extent will that match our norms and values, right? So, and are we? But we have to take action, right here. So there's room for agents that have to step in order to counterbalance this very dangerous tendency in our societies.
If I summarize your question, so this is a question for the whole panel. You said the recognition of actors and change agency, does the field and the connections between them, the cooperation, interrelationships, does our field pay attention, or is our field recognizing this? So this is perhaps, if I understood you correctly.
How can we improve on that?
How can we what?
Improve the social relationships.
That. Who would like to take a first step at that? Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I say something to that extent. As you saw, there is, of course, a realization of the different levels of individuals, of the entities, institutions, and then also the regional scale. And I suppose what André was talking about, the circular economy, of course, engaging with also the realization that there might be not acceptance levels that are just given. So I'm not sure if this resonates with the question, but of course there is a notion going on that there has to be a more multidimensional, multiscalar type of approach that should be pursued in the future. And I suppose with the work Ron is trying to do on institutions, that might certainly be something a lot of people will do. But I think it's a very valid point you make there. It's been probably neglected in the past.
Who else would like to? Grete? Because I think your presentation talks about this also, the recognition of actors and the relationships, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, there was, forgive me, I'm forgetting the authors, maybe you're in this room. Recently, Regional Studies, just within the last year, published a paper on reinvigorating the role of agency and thinking about regional development. So I think we hopefully actually each of these talks in their own way set the stage for doing so. But I think in relation to the first question and in relation to the communities where I study, I think investigating the role of agency needs to be counterbalanced with a realization of the constraints, structural constraints within that those actors and institutions are operating. So I think, kind of going back to the 2010s and when resilience was a really big concept, I mean, that kind of came under critique for offering maybe too much weight on the agency of the local when placed up against structural pressures, including now we're seeing like the hollowing out of key institutions, knowledge-producing institutions, universities, and also key institutions for, innovation and growth. So I think, yes, there's like a need to recognize, recognize and and map, the actors which are involved as agents of regional change, but putting that in conversation with structural dynamics at the moment will also be important.
André, do you want to add from a territorial circular ecosystem perspective?
Yes, of course. I think that the local actors are really crucial on both sides, because they can help to implement new projects, they can help to open the paths for the future but they can also hinder, and they can so stop the projects. If I come back just to my claim of today about circular economy, you know, on the one hand, I claim that if you involve local actors into this into this project, you can open ways for transition and so on and so on. But on the other hand, also they can oppose to those projects. For example, if you look at the project on anaerobic digestion, which is very important, especially in Europe, especially in Germany, for example, which are really a way to cope and really a way to have new energy and local energy as well, because it also responds to the crisis of energy in Europe and also a local possibility of development. But they can be really impeached by local agents, because if people, the neighbors, are against those projects, if they oppose, because they think they are too dangerous, because they think they will impact the price of the housings, because they are against the circulation of trucks or lorries, because they are against the odors, for example, all those kind of things, they can really go against that, and we see that every day. So there are those two sides. So with those local actors, if they are mobilized, they can open the way for the future, but they also can restrict, and they can say, for example, for environmental transition, either they could think, okay, climate change doesn't exist, for example, or on the other hand, it's finished, everything is done. So it's too late, so let's rock and roll.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, you want to add?
Yeah, just quickly add, so we talk about agency and structural change, and I think what Ron was talking about in terms of agency and institutional change and policy change, so policy understood as a kind of subset of institutions. And we tend to see kind of systems and policy kind of separated, but of course they are mediated by the role of actors. And in our work on policy mixes, like many years ago, we talked about actors, actions, and interactions. Mm-hmm. So, and remember we did a special issue, I think, with Marco a few years ago, where we were talking about agency in policy. So actors say policies, but also so there is agency in policy in terms of implementation, in terms of enabling and constraining things, and also in the anticipating policy. And sometimes kind of that anticipation might make policy less effective or less effective over time. So that, I think there's a lot of scope for future work, basically. Mm-hmm. Maybe, yeah, Ron is going to do it, all of it. Yeah. Yes.
Do you want to add, Maria? Ron?
Yeah, maybe I was thinking about an example of this role of agency within, I'm quoting this work of this friend of mine, Abel Marin, who has been working on conflicts at the regional level, of conflicts related to the civil society acceptance or rejection of new mining sites in developing countries. And I think this is a very interesting example of the role of agency of civil society within a context where, as I was saying, policy is going so the geopolitical landscape going in a direction, and we try to oppose to some extent. We can do it at different levels. We can do it by tackling policy priorities I was mentioning, but also by incorporating the role of civil society when they actually gather enough agency to redirect policy, so to redesign policy priorities that need to be achieving a just twin transition as the way. This is not a buzzword. We really need to get there. So that's probably an example, and I think it's a very nice example of local agency.
Mm-hmm. Just add to that role of universities as key actors, as so John was talking about earlier about universities, and we see the different reaction in the US, for instance, when they are under threat. So there is agency there, right? Mm-hmm. And so the different, so the way in which they enact that agency is it's very interesting. So,
or called resistance, basically. Yeah. That's what could be. Yeah.
Ron, do you want to add?
Just to add is that indeed the actions of agents they will change from place to place, right? So I mean this is exactly about this anti-science-based movement. It's really changing America right now because they are eroding the foundations of the NHS, the National Science Foundation. It's about academic freedom. It's about, I was checking my public, because I have to travel in a few weeks to the US, and I was thinking about, okay, did I use the word diversity in my research, right? I mean, and if you think about it, it's ridiculous. But that's the way it is right now in the US. I don't see that happening in Europe, right? So it differs from place to place. In my own country, I mean, we have a tendency that we go into that direction, right? So we already, they took €1 billion from Dutch universities last year. So you see it happening there, but it is different, right? So because it is a different context in which that debates take place, the opposition is different, the institutional context is very different. The Netherlands is not the US, so you see huge differences, and this is geography, right? So.
Okay, thank you. Are there more questions from the audience? Okay, so we have two. Look to the other side. Any more? So let's start.
Yes, thank you. I have a question for all the speakers, also including Heike yourself. So the association has been very successful promoting global engagement through divisions, through supporting research networks. I have a question for all the speakers. How are you envisioning incorporate more research also on not only case, but also better theorization of the research from the Global South beyond the focus of Europe, US. So I want to hear your insight on that.
So we didn't really hear. It's really difficult, the acoustics up here. So how do you, last part?
How do you better incorporate not only the case studies, but also more how to better theoreticalize the insights from the Global South? So because many of the current studies are applying theories developed for the Global North context for the Global South.
How do we incorporate Global South perspectives in our research? So, yeah, Grete?
Thank you for bringing this question forward. I think it's something that needs to be a point of discussion here in forums like this and among the regional studies field in general. I've thought about this a lot with regards to the Left Behind Places literature, which is very global North and West centric. And I think in part, well, first I'll say I think the Left Behind Places literature has some ground to cover in building theory. That's part of what I was, or at least building on pre-existing theory. That's what I was, a piece of what I was hoping to argue in my commentary. And regarding the Global South, I guess I'll say first is that we have a big problem there and a big gap in Left Behind Places and theorizing regional inequality generally. These theories are built for Global North contexts. The story that I told is one of deindustrialization of the Global North, which doesn't account for the elsewheres of where that productivity ended up. And what regional unevenness looks like in, less wealthy countries. So I think, my answer maybe is like a bit of a strategic non-answer, but just to call for more. And I think in particular with regards to the regional inequality question, this is the Global South, or thinking about regional inequality, subnational regional inequality within the Global South, I think will allow us to problematize power in a way that current Left Behind Places discourses don't. So I see a lot of opportunity there, maybe more opportunity for import from theoretical development from the Global South to migrate up to the Global North, whereas I think taking and just copy and pasting current thinking on left behind places from the Global North and placing it into the Global South isn't fitting. It's not been built to do that. So if anyone would like to talk about partnerships and collaborations to do that further, I would love to chat afterwards.
I'm looking at the clock. Let's keep going into our coffee break for 5 to 10 more minutes to continue. There are more raised hands. André, Maria, or Ron, yeah?
Yes, I find something very fascinating. We are at an era of deindustrialization of Europe and also of extreme tourism. And this extreme tourism, it affects both the most central places, like the main big European cities, and the most peripheral areas, which are on the border of the sea and in the extreme parts of Europe. So this is very interesting. So the same phenomenon is hitting the center and the extreme periphery. So we have to think about that.
Maria, 2 sentences.
Very quickly, I'll do it very quickly. I think it's a great question. Thank you very much. Very briefly, personally, I think I do incorporate Global South theoretical. I mean, I've been talking about core periphery theories applied to Europe and technological dependency, and I think they're still quite powerful concepts that we could usefully use. And as many of my beloved PhD students know, I'm also incorporating structuralism into whatever we discuss, particularly when we talk about, well, European core peripheral region structure. So I think it's important and I think it's valid. Thank you very much.
Ron?
Yeah, I think it's a very important question. Of course, I've done only work on the Global North, so I can only imagine how the Global South works. But I think we can improve a lot. Because if I also see at this conference, and I've seen a few paper presentations on the Global South, they use exactly the same framework that we have developed in the Global North. And then, of course, you might find a bit different outcomes, but the framework is still the same. I think this framework should be changed because those are very different societies. If I use because I want to use global institutional data sets, but I don't think it's very valid to do that because these have been all collected by the so big NGOs or the World Bank or whatever. And they have a kind of philosophy, right? So, and they think what they think are institutions and how it would be measured, and they just apply that to the whole world. And then they think, yeah, but then we can compare countries. But maybe those variables do not really capture those differences because you need very different variables in order to measure institutions in the Global South. And that, I think, is not that we are very strong at right now. And this, I think, is a major challenge for future research. I have no answer to that, and because I have zero understanding of that, but I really truly believe that that is the case, that we should adopt another framework.
Elvira, you had quick two sentences.
Just an invitation to send more papers about the Global South to regional studies. As an editor, we discuss that we don't get enough papers like Latin America, Africa. So, yeah, it is important and we want more. So, do send your papers.
May I add also 2 comments from a Regional Studies Association perspective? I mean, we've been very successful expanding the networks and having sort of local conferences in Latin America, Asian regions. I think we also need to think about different methods of holding conferences, not only to incorporate such a perspective, but also to keep our footprint down. And why not have regional hub conferences? This changes also dynamics of discussions. And then the post-colonial methods. I myself, we work in a project with Colombia on entrepreneurial ecosystems. I think we can learn a lot from such contexts and use different methods of engagement with Global South colleagues. So in that way, I think we are a community that is open to that. Okay, we are 5 minutes over. Another 5 minutes, it's okay. There are 2 more hands, I think, there's one more, yeah. Okay, yeah. One in the front and one in the back, and then we are finished, yeah. Perhaps first in the front, yeah.
Yeah, Chris Gebhardt, thank you very much. I spent almost half of my life in industry, and I'm very glad that you open up the whole arena for how does industry innovate. Yeah. We had this discussion, innovation comes from unexpected places, citizens, lost places, whatever, but I like your approaches, especially your approach. What is really going on? It has completely changed how the industry and also the multinational enterprises innovate. And I started with political economy, Dickens, and you know, making large technological systems, Renato Mainz. And I think we have to maybe have an answer how to do it, go back and bring this back into the research. It's really a black box. Thank you for opening it. Mm-hmm. And you should follow this strain really and intensify it.
Yeah. Let's take the question in the back as the last question.
What an honor. Thanks a lot. A short one. Have we become too normative? And maybe also, are we too much on the leash of policy? So maybe some short reflections on that.
Okay, one sentence as a concluding sentence. Ron, you want to start? You have to switch on your microphone.
No, I better make a joke. No, well, normative, I don't know. I mean, can we do anything in science without being a bit normative? I mean, so it's not value free, right? So okay.
One more sentence on the leash of policy. Yeah. Each of you one sentence, yeah. Maria, you want to add as a final concluding answer to this question?
There's never too normative, I think. But I think we're social scientists, and I think we need some guidance on that. But I don't think we got it so normative in a way. But then again, normative to me means in a SPRU tradition, evidence-based, which requires science as well. So, yeah, thanks.
I think we're always going to be normative, even if we don't realize it. I mean, we're not value-free, and we always, as long as we're honest about it and we're explicit about it, but we shouldn't be prescriptive. I think that would be my answer. We have to be very careful, and sometimes we fall into that trap of prescription.
Mm-hmm. You mean, by normative, you mean ideological. That's what you said.
Let's move on, because that question we can pose for coffee. Yeah, André.
Well, I don't know if it's normative or prescriptive, but definitely we need to provide more solutions, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to second that. Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
I like that.
Thanks, Tom, for that good question. I'm just going to refer to policy, and I think there is a little bit of a danger. We should do research to shape policy, not policy should shape our research. And if you would Google how much smart specialization papers were published in regional studies, you would probably be horrified. And they were studied after the policy was put in place. And I appreciate that we should study effectiveness and implementation of policy, but we should not just follow it, we should shape it. Mm-hmm. And I leave it with that.
Yeah, perfect last sentences. Thank you very much to you in the audience, but also to our great panel. Thank you.